Hey everybody, welcome back to Race of History. We're going to get into part 2 of Extra History's flu pandemic series. Later on this afternoon, I will put out part 2 of the Sabaton history for Soldier of Three Armies. And I think in here somewhere, because it's I believe, 3-part Sabaton history series, I think I'm going to throw in one of the new Sabaton songs from the album that doesn't have a Sabaton history yet. That way I can get another Sabaton song in there, but I also am not getting behind on a Sabaton history. So that's the plan for the next day or so. But this is what we're going to start with. Extra History, Trench Fever. Let's get into it.
It stalked into camp when the day was damp and chilly and cold. It crept by the guards and murdered my pards, with a hand that was clammy and bony and bold. And its breath was icy and moldy and dank, and it killed so speedy and gloatingly greedy, that it took away men from each company rank. Private Joshua Lee, 34th Infantry Division, 1919. When we left off, the 1918 flu was aboard troop transports headed for the battlefields of France. And though this first wave of the virus was comparatively mild, its time in the trenches would reforge it into a hardened killer of men and help tip the balance of the war. In early April, it erupted among the American troops at their disembarkation ground in Brest. By April 10th, the first cases began showing up in the French army, which generally trained and served alongside American units. It was hard to notice at first. High fever, headache, and weakness could come from many diseases that swirled around the trenches, such as insect-borne trench fever or typhus. But it soon became clear that this was different. The troops called it 3-day fever, knock-me-down fever, or la grippe. It rarely killed, but men who got it were out of action for days and lead-footed for weeks. The overcrowded camps and trenches of the Western Front were ideal tinder for an epidemic. Men lived within inches of each other, their immune systems compromised from exhaustion and disease. And unlike a city where the virus might run out of victims, here, fresh bodies were rotated onto the line every few days. It spread to the British in early May, and by then, there was no hope of containment. It swept through them like a bad spirit. English hospitals saw over 36,000 admissions for flu in a single month. Only then, when it began undermining the troops' ability to fight, did military doctors raise the alarm. The outbreak had sprung up during a critical phase of the war.
That's kind of crazy, right? That it wasn't until it was so bad that it was actually impacting the war that then the military doctors were like, okay, well, this is becoming a problem. I guess on one hand, it's not killing everybody. And so, and with the conditions of the trenches, it's easy to see how you could kind of downplay it, right? Because the conditions of the trenches are so horrible that, there is so much rampant illness that I feel like it all kind of could run and cloud together. But it does seem kind of crazy that it took until literally it was hurting their ability to fight before there was this like, oh well, we should probably try to figure this out. It's kind of crazy.
The Germans had launched a massive spring offensive, and Allied generals needed every man possible on the line. But as spring turned to summer, the frontline hospitals of the Allies swelled to overcapacity. Men on the front lines would get ready to rotate to the rear, only to find that the unit ordered to relieve them had instead gone into quarantine. Medical tents had run out of space, and some hospitals took to laying patients outside on canvas tarps. In late May, a group of French recruits came down with it. 69% of them had to be hospitalized, and 5% died. Wow. By the end of the summer, 10% of the British Army had fallen ill. Back in Washington, D.C., Welch and his epidemiologists finally took notice. The flu, previously ignored, became a matter of national security. They set about turning the Rockefeller Institute into an information gathering and communications center for the disease. Welch wanted anything he could get his hands on: reports, lung samples, information on treatment, so he dispatched doctors to centers of infection to swab.
This is the part that I'm super interested in, right? We have this idea today of how science works, but it's based off of, you know, decades, even centuries of prior medical knowledge, right? And we have technology today that is insane. You know, doctors of this time period probably just wouldn't believe it. Um, but when you don't have that, when you don't have the technology, when you don't have a ton of the prior information, when you don't know exactly what it is you're going up against, how do you figure it out? How do you drill down on what it is? You know, how to in any way, shape, or form minimize damage of this outbreak. And so this is the part I'm really interested in is who and how it was figured out. You know, who was the Sherlock Holmes that went through and deciphered all of the information and figured it out.
Throats and collect samples. But all of it remained a closely guarded secret. No one wanted the Central Powers to know that the Allies were being weakened by disease. Upon entering the war, both the US and Britain had clamped down on the press with unprecedented censorship measures. When American officers denied or minimized reports of the flu, newspapers at home accepted it without question. The British, for their part, tried to strangle any mention of the spreading plague. But with the virus now infecting the civilian population, news of an epidemic started to leak. In May, the virus arrived in Madrid, and since Spain was neutral, it wasn't subject to wartime censorship. There, the flu made front-page news, especially once it infected the king. It whipped through Spanish cities, passing from person to person so fast that local wits named it after a hit opera song, The Naples Soldier. It was as catchy as the song, the joke went, if more deadly. International
Jeez.
newspapers picked up the story on the Madrid outbreak and, erroneously, assumed the disease had originated there. And from those articles, the killer gained another name, the Spanish flu. But it wasn't just the Allies covering up the flu's impact. On the other side of no man's land, the German commander, General Ludendorff, was also wrestling with the disease. Ludendorff had gained day-to-day command of the German military in 1916, along with a huge amount of political power, and he'd used it to embark on a bold plan to save the Kaiser and Germany.
Okay, so this is a little bit off subject, but we've covered a handful of World War One things on this channel. Ludendorff, you know, he has the big moment in Belgium where he you know takes a city by himself. Basically, he's banging on the door with the hilt of his sword. He does really, really well on the Eastern Front against the Russians. Eventually, he is put in charge of the Western Front. And at that point, he, for all intents and purposes, he becomes military dictator of Germany. Like, he is making the decisions. I can't remember who it was. There's some writer, I think it was a British writer, who said that Ludendorff had the Kaiser in the corner playing with his toys. But that really, like, Ludendorff ran the show, you know, during his stint of the war.
And to be honest, it hadn't gone so well. First, he'd planned to crush the Allied supply lines with unrestricted submarine warfare. Instead, it had helped drag America into the conflict. Now, 84,000 Americans were arriving on the Western Front each month. But that would be a surmountable problem if he could knock Russia out of the war and free up the troops fighting on the Eastern Front. Luckily for him, a revolution had broken out against the Tsar. And to fuel the chaos, he helped transport a famous Bolshevik revolutionary, one Vladimir Lenin, back to Russia.
Yeah, some people don't know that. The Germans actually put him on a train car. And I think I don't know if this is true or not. The story is that they locked the train car doors so that he could not speak to anybody on his way to Russia. They felt like his ideas were the plague, and they wanted that plague to hit Russia and get them out of the war, but not to infect anybody else.
The plan worked. Kinda. Ludendorff had hoped the strict peace terms he'd foisted on Russia would scare other allies into opening negotiations. But instead, the harsh treaty only had convinced them that peace was not possible until they achieved total victory, and forced an equally punishing treaty on Germany. But at least Ludendorff now had his 50 divisions from the Eastern Front, and he'd use them for one more, all-or-nothing shot at winning the war. He'd retrained the freed-up veterans as assault specialists, stormtroopers, and launched his massive spring offensive in hopes of securing victory before the Americans arrived in force. As the offensive began, Ludendorff's army had better trained troops, superior tactics, higher morale, and for a brief time, numerical superiority. And at the beginning, it all went so well. German troops had captured more territory than they had since 1914.
Yeah, and this is the story of World War One, right? I mean, you have these continued offensives that can see some level of success initially, at least later on in the war. So, you have this World War One is just so weird in terms of warfare, because you have at the very beginning of the war some tactics and ideas work, but they're like trial tactics, right? These haven't been deployed in a widespread manner before. And so sometimes they see initial success. Things like using gas, right? When the Germans used gas for the first time, that could have been extremely successful. There was almost a huge breakthrough, but the Germans hadn't really anticipated having a huge breakthrough. It was more or less kind of like a trial thing of like, let's see how this works, right? And it's this weird, back and forth of forgetting old tactics that don't work anymore, things like cavalry or bayonet charges, and trying out these new sort of tactics. But even in the offenses that, you have these massive offensives that work. Russia had one, later on in the war or later on in their war, that worked for a while. And it was really successful initially. But, these offensives, even the really successful ones initially, just always seemed to grind down. And eventually it was the exact same playing field as it always was, where the continued offensive just cost you more and more and more casualties. And so you got to a breaking point, and then everything would stall, and it would be the same thing, right? You would either, hold just that spot and not be able to push an inch forward, or in a lot of cases, you would end up getting pushed back close to where the original line was, just because you had used all of your energy with that initial push.
And driven a wedge between the British and the French. But the Allies had held on to the strategic port roads and railroad junctions. All the ground that Ludendorff captured was worthless, shell-churned dirt. And they'd taken a lot of casualties. So the next phase of the operation was critical. But as he began to organize for a final push, his generals requested a delay. The German army, you see, had the flu. They'd caught it in June, probably from a British prisoner of war, and by July it was sweeping the ranks. German troops, their systems already weak from food rationing, appeared especially susceptible to infection. 500,000 soldiers were sick. In some units, a quarter of the men were too ill to fight. Ludendorff delayed the attack 5 days. After that, the commanders would just have to deal with the reduced unit strength. Meanwhile, the Allies, who had caught the flu earlier in the spring and summer, were recovering. Despite sickness, exhaustion, and casualty depletion, on July 15th, the German army marshaled for their one last attack. A rolling bombardment pounded the French and American lines as they advanced. Stormtroopers rushed behind with fast-moving infiltration tactics. Gas shells turned the battlefield into a chemical hell. But the French, British, and Americans held and counterattacked. And they would keep counterattacking for 100 days, pushing the Germans back step by step. Ludendorff had failed. Within weeks, he was shut in his office, suffering a nervous breakdown. And by October, he was fleeing across the Swedish border in sunglasses and a fake beard. Now, it would be wrong to say the flu defeated Ludendorff's spring offensive because there were other factors. It was an overambitious operation with a nebulous goal. He kept changing the objectives, units outran their supply lines, and he lost too many men. But German accounts do suggest the flu bled the army's manpower and resolve at a critical moment. And just as it had tipped the balance, it was gone. In August, British hospitalizations fell to the point that they had declared the epidemic over. But it wasn't over. For as the balance of the war was shifting, so were the virus's genes. Even today, no one's sure what happened. Perhaps the original, deadly virus had temporarily mutated into a mild strain, only to have its lethality reemerge. Or it may have infected someone, even an animal, that had a different version of the flu and the two viruses combined. It's even possible that, as it passed through millions of soldiers, this avian virus was gradually adapting itself to human hosts.
My favorite theory, I'm not saying the theory that is necessarily the most believable, but my favorite theory about this is that essentially it was to do with all of the chemicals being used on, in the war. That's the thing that would at least be the most intriguing to me, I guess. But yeah, Ludendorff definitely did not, the Germans did not lose this war because of the flu. By this point of the war, they're in a pretty tight situation. Their time frame is extremely short. The U.S. is obviously bringing a lot of men over, and the Germans have this kind of one sliver of time where they have to make everything happen. It was a very, very difficult proposition. Even if there was no flu at all, the chances are that this all fails, right? Like it was a very hard ask that Ludendorff was giving to the German military. But I'm sure the flu wiped out their manpower. I mean, a lot of the numbers are of flu on the front are crazy. A lot of the domestic numbers of flu are crazy.
Most frightening of all, the war itself may have given it a nudge, because the soldiers the flu infected had been exposed to a chemical agent known to cause genetic mutation.
Yeah, my favorite one. This is my favorite theory.
Mustard gas. The soldiers' throat and lung cells laced with chemical weapons may have helped increase the rate of genetic shift and raise the likelihood that a new strain would develop. However it happened, the virus that emerged from the trenches was both highly contagious and severely lethal. It could kill within 24 hours of presenting symptoms, drowning a patient in their own fluids. And while common flu strains primarily kill the very old and very young, the 1918 flu struck people down in the prime of life. The mild first wave was over, and the second lethal wave was about to begin. In fact, it was already making itself known on the troop ships delivering soldiers to nations across the globe. The Naples soldier was on the march.
Man, this is such a good series. I'm definitely going to get into the next part of this tomorrow. I will put out the second part of the Sabaton history for Soldier of Three Armies later today. As always, like, comment, subscribe. Help me keep building the channel over here. I will put the link to the Discord down below. Also, whenever I get my order in for the surstroming, I will give everybody a heads up and kind of give everybody a time frame for the video and all that. Remember, it's kind of a 1,000 subscribers celebration, more or less. So that'll be probably terrible, but it'll be all right. But I'll give everybody more of a heads up whenever I'm getting everything ready for the video. Right now I'm looking for all of the other kind of like ingredients that I need. But yeah, I'll get that other video out later today, and I'll see you all then.